World leaders likely had one overwhelming question this week. What does Donald Trump's return to the White House really mean? What will he actually do? Many people all across America may have had the exact same question. So welcome to Talking Politics USA. Hello. Well, if it didn't quite feel real a week ago, it sure does now. Donald Trump back in the White House.
Politics is tough, and it's in many cases not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate it very much. A transition that's so smooth, it'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that, Joe.
You're welcome.
There will be many surreal moments in the coming weeks as the former president returns to power, but this one may be hard to beat. Donald Trump and Joe Biden sitting in front of a log fire in the Oval Office, shaking hands and discussing an orderly transfer of power, a courtesy that was, of course, not afforded when roles were reversed 4 years ago. And Dan joins me from Washington, I'm pleased to say. Dan, what a week, what a result, what an interesting 4 years we are going to have. I don't really know where we start. I think people will have a series of questions, but kind of the biggest catch-all one is, what's his government actually going to be like? Let's just talk with some of the stuff we've had today, or in the last sort of 2 days. Appointment of a new defense secretary, a suggestion that they're going to make it easier to fire generals who don't agree with them. Let's just start there. What do you make of that? What's it actually going to mean? What is the purpose of it?
It's quite interesting, the kind of variety of people that Donald Trump has picked. I suppose the common thread is complete loyalty to him. And, you know, added into that, if you've been on TV, that seems to propel you much higher up the list of picks than if you haven't, especially if you've been on Fox News. So, look, I mean, I think the most surprising of all the cabinet picks is Pete Hegseth, who is the new Secretary of State for Defence. Pete who, you might ask? Well, exactly. I think most people would be scrambling to Google his name. He has had no real profile in the defence policy world at all before. He's an ex-Fox News anchor. He is a veteran. He served in the National Guard in both Iraq and Afghanistan, but he, you know, but not as a sort of general or anyone super high up in the Pentagon. He is relatively unknown and very outspoken and unorthodox. And I think the idea and the result is that he will shake things up and you know, conceivably. Ruffle some feathers deliberately in the Pentagon to shake up the orthodoxy. But someone that no one was really expecting. He's got no high-level experience at all. He's never held an elected office in his life. There's lots of weird videos of him online. I don't know if you had a chance to see any of them. Selling soap and ammunition and. All kinds of weird things, throwing axes as part of a TV thing where he missed the target and almost killed someone on the other side of the target. So, he's a larger-than-life character, heavily tattooed, very outspoken, very loyal to Trump.
I mean, I have seen some of the videos. How do you think he wants to shake things up? How do you think Donald Trump wants to shake things up in the military? I mean, I saw the new defense secretary saying, for example, an old video that he didn't want women in combat roles. One can imagine some of it. But given that Donald Trump says, I don't want to be involved in wars, what do they actually want out of the Pentagon?
Well, I mean, I think that's one thing, is this sort of, war on woke, I suppose you could sum it up, really. And that, would encapsulate, women in frontline roles. I would imagine a forensic look at spending. It's always pretty transactional when it comes to Donald Trump. He wants to drill into where the money is going, what it's being spent on, and are they getting value for money, all of which, is a laudable aim. But I think the concern among the kind of establishment here, the military establishment, is that a lot of departments might get scrapped, a lot of lower level generals might get pushed aside for those that pledge unswerving loyalty to Donald Trump himself. So it threatens to be a pretty sort of turbulent time. I mean, one thing about Pete Hegseth is, like some of the other appointments, he is an outspoken hawk on China and Iran, but particularly China. So I think that does fall in line with Marco Rubio, for example, who has been announced as the top diplomat, the Secretary of State, taking over from Antony Blinken. Again, someone who has almost devoted his life in a way to speaking out about China. And that's informed partly by his own personal backstory. Marco Rubio is the son of 2 Cuban immigrants. His father escaped from the communist regime in Havana in 1962. So, I think that's kind of, shaped who he is politically. But some pretty surprising picks. We haven't had many yet, but as you look down the list, it's raising eyebrows, let's put it that way.
OK, I'd like to come back to the military in a little bit, but let's just move on down the line. Elon Musk, as predicted, he is going to have a role basically shrinking the government, potentially by many, many billions, if not trillions of dollars. Do we have any sense yet of what that's going to mean, what the shape of it is, where he's going to go for these, cuts and inefficiencies, they're calling them? You got any sense at all of how that's going to play out?
Yeah, we do, because he is an inveterate poster on the social media platform that he owns, X, and I think today put out a post saying we're going to have a kind of leaderboard of the biggest sort of waste of money in his eyes, government departments which they think are poor value for money. And if anyone objects to things that they're going to scrap, then get in touch and tell us not to. He has previously said there are, I think, 435 different federal agencies, and he thinks that the United States could get away with just 99. So that would suggest getting rid of about 3/4 of the federal agencies, and one would assume the number of federal employees, maybe not quite in proportion, but a huge number. We're talking, potentially thousands of federal employees who face losing their jobs, having their departments wound up because Elon Musk has been appointed to this Department of Government Efficiency, along, interestingly, with Vivek Ramaswamy as well, a former rival of Donald Trump's politically, who's also now been brought inside the tent.
Let's just move on down the line, talk about foreign policy for a bit. I mean, obviously, we should discuss Ukraine. We know his views on China, and I think I haven't seen too much that indicates any new thinking on China from him. I mean, he's obviously quite hostile. But before we get to talking about Ukraine, can we just talk about the Middle East? As I understand it, the new ambassador to Israel, have I got this wrong? Because I only sort of glanced over it today. But as I understand it, he's sort of on record as saying there is no such thing as the West Bank. It's only, Judea and Samaria. These are not settlements, populated by Jewish inhabitants. They're just places they live, and so on and so on. And for anyone who doesn't understand the significance of that, obviously the West Bank is Palestinian land. It was land deemed to be Palestinian by the UN resolution of 1948. That's never changed. Obviously, there are these incredibly controversial and illegal Jewish settlements on the land. And here is the new American ambassador effectively saying there's no such thing as Palestinian land. I mean, that is so much more extreme, really, isn't it, than anyone might have expected, even from Trump, who we know is very pro-Israel.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Huckabee, Sarah Sanders Huckabee's dad, former governor of Arkansas, has been appointed to this key role in the Middle East, the US ambassador to Israel. And you're right, the way he talks about the West Bank, it's, some people I've seen online suggesting, his words, you could barely separate them from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's words. He's incredibly staunchly pro-Israel, but more than that, echoing the most extreme elements of the Israeli government when it comes to Palestinian rights. And that sends a signal, clearly, that must be, in part where Donald Trump's thinking that Middle East policy goes, and where does that leave Gaza? Where does that leave the war in Lebanon? It suggests not just a continuation of providing weapons and support for Israel, but something much more fulsome in the backing of Prime Minister Netanyahu's government and their policies in the Middle East, aggressive expansionist policies on the West Bank in terms of settlers and so on. So I think the signals are definitely there. I mean, Marco Rubio as well, is a very outspoken, staunch ally of Israel, quite echoing the right-wing views of parts of the Israeli government. So people will infer from that is what President Trump wants and what he believes in.
Let's talk about Ukraine. I mean, I don't see, there's been a debate, this disputed phone call with Vladimir Putin, so we don't even know whether the phone call existed, let alone whether it, what may or may not have been discussed. Is there any way of reading, obviously that's so critical for Ukraine. Ukraine is so dependent on American support. Everyone I talk to who's involved in the European defense establishment says it's really difficult to see how Ukraine can soldier on without American support. Partly it's the money, partly it's the kit, a lot of European kit, very denuded and so on. I mean, is there anything really to take us on that, or is that just a wait and see, as in we've got to just see how that plays out over the first few weeks of Donald Trump's tenure?
Well, I think what's interesting with Marco Rubio, he has definitely shifted his position to align himself, to mould himself more along Donald Trump's worldview when it comes to Ukraine. He was initially very outspoken in favour of the Ukrainian cause and against Russian aggression. He's mollified that a bit now and is sort of saying that there is need for a negotiated settlement, that effectively this is a war in which there is a stalemate, and that all that America is doing under the current Biden administration is arming up to the point that there is a stalemate and not enough for victory and not denuding them enough for defeat either. So Donald Trump has boasted frequently that he could will bring the war to an end within 24 hours of coming to office. We've had supposedly this call, as you say, with President Putin of Russia, although the Kremlin denies the call happened. The Trump campaign have neither confirmed nor denied that it happened. Donald Trump has also had a call with President Zelensky as well. And interestingly, Elon Musk was on that call. That shows you what a central role he looks like he's going to play, not just in cutting red tape, but potentially on foreign policy in Ukraine as well. I think, what they are trying to do is bring this to some sort of conclusion. And the conclusion, it seems to me, that is unavoidable is that Ukraine may have to accept that it is not going to get back some of the territory it lost in this Russian invasion, namely Crimea and parts of the Donbass, in order to have some sort of political settlement. But that is going to be toxic for President Zelensky domestically. I remember, I've been there a lot. You remember year before last and through the war, and the idea of any kind of surrender of territory in the Donbass, of places like Mariupol, which, people, are desperate to get back under Ukrainian control, is really, really difficult for them to swallow. And I think that's going to be very, very hard for the domestic politics of President Zelensky to try and sell to the Ukrainian people, even after the war that has dragged on for almost 2 years.
Dan, I well remember you did some shocking and deeply memorable and horrible, frankly, reportage about war crimes in particular. But let me move on to another topic at home in America. Donald Trump has sent out very, very clear signals that he absolutely meant what he said about illegal migrants, that they're going to be deported and that's the end of it. Now, you know as well as I do that the estimate is that there are 20 million illegal migrants. Now, you only have to stop and think about that for about 5 minutes before you realise the scale of that task. I mean, even just a tiny proportion of that 20 million is a huge number of people. Like, what are you going to do with them? How are you going to round them up? Where are you going to house them? You presumably you can't bust them straight to the border. Like, has there been I mean, what do you think about that? Has there been any any kind of detail about how that might be achieved? And what happens if the governors in some Democratic states, like you think of Gavin Newsom in California or Gretchen Whitmer or Josh Shapiro, like if any of them say, and I have heard some governors saying we're not doing it, if they refuse, what happens? Does he call in the army? Does the army agree? Does the army refuse? How do you think, what's the detail and how do you think that realistically plays out?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to setting up for a kind of real tussle, isn't it, over the next years and months. But he said one of his priorities is to start the biggest mass deportation in American history. The people that he's put in thus far, Kristi Noem's been put in charge of Homeland Security. She's a former governor of South Dakota. You know, very, very outspoken, hardline, totally in line with Donald Trump. The same with Pete Hegseth as well at the Department of Defense. Wholesome, fulsome backing of Donald Trump's plans and aspirations on mass deportation. The implication would be that these people have been put in those roles not because of their experience, but because they are going to do exactly as they are told by Donald Trump. They are going to implement to the letter his desire to kick out anyone who is here illegally. The task, though, is massive, Tom, as you alluded to. We're talking about millions of people potentially. We're talking about families, you know, who may end up being separated. People that have been here. I mean, I remember talking to one woman down in Arizona who was still here, you know, illegally, but had been here for most of her adult life, who've built, you know, families here, who've got married, who have careers here, who are facing a very uncertain and unstable future. In addition to that, of course, you've got all of the, you know, promises to fortify the border, literally sending special forces down there if necessary has been one suggestion. You know, don't quite know how that works with Mexico on the other side of the border as well. But this will be a very turbulent and controversial part of his second term. I think a keystone, really, of his domestic policy. He knows one of the reasons he was elected was because people feel immigration has got out of control. And if you look at the figures, immigration has spiked under President Biden. And he feels he now has a mandate to aggressively reduce those numbers, not only because he has won the presidency, but they also have control of both the Senate and almost certainly the House of Representatives. There's a few seats left to call, but that looks nailed on. And looks like he's won the popular vote as well. So I think all of those things could have coalesced to driving political momentum behind this idea that they are going to drive this through come hell or high water.
Well, I mean, you know, we should be absolutely clear, as you are. There is obviously popular support for this. You know, he's got a mandate, as you say. It's clear that immigration was a driving issue. I suppose there's no way of knowing, though, that if suddenly hundreds of thousands of people are rounded up on the streets that may be people's neighbours and friends and families and employees. I mean, is there any way of knowing how that plays out? Does Trump find suddenly people are disquieted by the reality, even if they wanted it in practical terms? Or do you just think, look, people are they just want this done now, and it doesn't sort of matter how it's done?
Well, I think it could politically backfire, as you've described. It could economically backfire as well, because a large part of the driving force of what is a very successful economy, inflation aside, but the economy is growing here, job creation is soaring. That is built on the back, in large part, of a lot of migrants that have come in and do a lot of these tough manual jobs that Americans may not want to do, and if you're suddenly going to say, right, we're kicking out millions of people, that could have huge economic impacts on growth as well, and that's one thing that Donald Trump will surely want to be judged on, and his handling of the economy. He prides himself on his reputation, deserved or not, as a a successful businessman and you know, a property magnate. So he will want to ensure that this remarkable economy that he is inheriting from Joe Biden continues into his second term.
Do we have any? I mean, we've talked about, you know, where you would house potentially hundreds of thousands of migrants while you process them. Presumably, I've seen no kind of credible idea of how you would do that, where they would go, where they would be held, and all the rest of it. But even leaving that aside, just rounding them up is a massive job. I mean, it's just hugely time-consuming. You know, potentially dangerous. I mean, who knows? You know, migrants may decide they don't want to go back to Mexico. I mean, you know, wherever it is, it's a very, very complicated thing. Do we know who would do it? Would it be the army? Would the army refuse to do it? Is that why they focus so much on controlling the military? Who is going to be responsible for actually implementing this?
Well, I mean, I would assume it will be the kind of federal homeland security agencies like ICE and then the border agencies and so on. But yeah, I mean, if you're taking on a task this big, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that you are going to have a huge increase in manpower. And the only real branch of government that has that kind of manpower and expertise is the military. Now, I haven't seen anyone sort of fleshing that out into, you know, what does this look like? Are we going to have kind of military kind of internment camps that migrants, illegal migrants, are sent to before they are deported? We know in the UK the difficulties with you know, governments pledging to bring down illegal immigration and then, you know, that colliding with the practical reality of trying to sift through, well, actually who is here illegally and who has a genuine case or who has a right to stay. So I think this is going to be a really difficult and incredibly controversial policy that, you know, I wonder if he, you know, once we get a couple of years into it, if he will begin to regret, because his reputation is going to be defined in part by his success at achieving this and the Republican Party's reputation going forward. If there is any sense that this has been a complete disaster, it's failed, it's caused enormous social upheaval and distressing scenes on TV of, you know, kids being separated from their parents and being, you know, sort of carted off in lorries to some sort of holding place where they're kicked out over the border. I think that could all massively backfire for him.
Last couple of very quick questions. Does he need the cooperation of the state authorities in this? Like, you know, does he need Gavin Newsom in California to go along with this? Is it credible that someone like the governor of California says, no, I'm not doing it, and in fact, I don't want any federal forces here. I'm going to, you know, tell the state police or the city police, you know, to block you? I mean, you can see how for a liberal Democratic governor, it could become a sort of political survival thing standing up to this. And, you know, for Trump, obviously, it's his political reputation to his supporters is on delivering it. Is it conceivable that there would be a confrontation? Does Donald Trump need the cooperation of the state machinery or not really? How do you see that playing out?
It's one of those kind of classic clashes in the US. I mean, we've seen it in Texas the other way round, where you know, the governor there has reinforced the border, you know, and put in measures against the will of Joe Biden's administration. And so, yeah, this is setting up a classic tussle between the federal government and the states, which do have enormous powers in the United States, and potentially a political tussle, as you say, in places like California that could be really problematic for Donald Trump. You know, a lot of the states down in the South, it must be said, are Republican controlled along the border, but there will be other places like California, as you point out, that aren't, that potentially will be a political flashpoint between the power of Washington, if you like, the power of the federal government, and the power of the state of California.
Whilst we've been recording this, I'm just told some of the American networks are now projecting that the House of Representatives has definitely gone to majority Republican control. I mean, I guess we should just pause a moment to note that, you know, this is you know, the House, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court, you know, not every president gets that kind of control, do they? This is a big moment for Donald Trump's project.
Yeah, it's a sort of clean sweep, isn't it? I'm just seeing the alerts coming in now. So they are projected to get 218 seats, I think, over the 218 threshold, sorry. So, yeah, I mean, I think that was in line with the projections, but looks like confirmation. I think when I last checked earlier today, there were about 12 seats left to call. What's interesting is some of the representatives who've been picked, like Elise Stefanik of New York to go and be the UN ambassador. That sort of takes her out of the pot, as it were, for the Republicans, and they'll have to have a special election to replace her. But that will take time. So it's been quite a balancing act that Donald Trump and his inner circle have had to pull off, picking some of these members of the House who they've sort of talent spotted for jobs that they want them to be in, but at the same time not denuding what is still a reasonably slim majority. They have, as you say, the Senate as well. We've had the election of the leader of the Senate as well today, so that's confirmation that John Thune of South Dakota is now going to take over from Mitch McConnell as the leader of the Senate. So, so this is a job that leads the Republican majority in the Senate, that sort of shapes the legislative agenda, if you like, and steers laws through. So an incredibly powerful role. And interestingly, he defeated Rick Scott of Florida, who had the support of some of Trump's staunchest allies like Elon Musk and Marco Rubio and so on. So, haven't got it all their own way. The vote in the Senate for the leader is a secret ballot, and John Thune got through on the second round to 29 votes to 24. So, the political sands are shifting here, but the theme is clear that Donald Trump is supreme. He has moulded the Republican Party in his image. I was down at the hotel literally round the back of our office here in Washington, D.C., where he arrived this morning to sort of do a victory lap, if you like, in front of all of the Republican lawmakers, thanking them, but knowing that he has definitively put his stamp on this party and there is zero room for dissent.
Dan, this is a subject I feel we will be coming back to very frequently over the next 4 years, but for now, thank you very much indeed. And that's certainly all we have time for this week. We'll be posting new episodes each week on YouTube and ITVX, as well as on all podcast platforms, if you prefer to listen to them. But for now, goodbye.